Good afternoon. On behalf of the Department of Justice, I would like to welcome you to today's presentation, Fiscal Year 2014 Coordinated Tribal Assistance Solicitation Budget Web Meeting. My name is Michelle Duhart-Tong, and I'm the Training and TA Lead for the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention's National Training and TA Center. In just a few minutes, you will hear from our featured presenter, Mr. Michael Williams, Staff Accountant with the Office of the Chief Financial Office. Before I introduce him, let's spend a few minutes ensuring you understand how to use the Adobe Connect tools to engage in this web meeting and fully participate. To view the handouts for the presentation today, please access the documents which are available now in the handouts pod of the webinar dashboard. There you will find the PowerPoint that's being used so you can take notes, as well as a point of contact list for each of the purpose areas. To send a chat message to me, your host, a panelist, or another attendee, click 1. Click the menu icon in the upper right corner of the chat pod. Choose Start Chat With, then select Hosts, Presenters, or Specific Attendees. 2. Type your message into the text box. And 3. Hit Enter or click the message bubble icon to send. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the name of the person registered and the total number of additional people in the room with you today. This will help us with our final count. Again, if you're viewing with a larger group, please type in the name of the person registered and the number of additional people joining you today. There will be ample opportunity for Q&A at the end of the web meeting today. Please type your questions in the chat window as they arise so that they will be in queue for a response. At the conclusion of today's web meeting, you will be provided with a link to take a 5-minute online survey about today's presentation. We appreciate your feedback. This information is used to assist us in planning the remaining CTAS web meetings scheduled for February 11th and February 20th. You will also be able to access the evaluation link on the last slide of the PowerPoint. Again, thank you for joining us today. Now let's hear from your featured presenter, Mr. Michael Williams.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Williams, and again, I am from the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. The budget presentation that I have for you will go through the various budget categories and also give you an idea of the situation, not the situations, but actually the information that each program office will be looking for from you in reference to filling out your budget. So again, there are various categories that you have to fill out if your particular program will have cost in that particular category. Let me go back. I think I advanced too many. First category is personnel. It is important when you're dealing with a program that people that are going to be working on this particular program, I, for the most part, try to not recommend that you use actual names, because sometimes if people leave that particular position, you may have to do again in order to change that particular person. So normally we would always suggest that you use positions. In the example here you can see grant coordinator, because based on the grant coordinator for any particular type of program, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not tied to an individual's name. So that makes it easier for you when you're, if someone happens to leave that particular position. But it is important that you do identify the title. So as you can see, whether it's a director, secretary, the title is most important because it allows the analyst or the person that's doing the review of your particular application to cross-reference that with the percentage. I'm sorry, not the percentage, but the compensation. Because again, the compensation should be complementary to the actual title of that particular position. Then also we're looking for the percentage of time that any individual is going to work on a particular program. So for example, if someone is only going to work 50% of their time on a particular program, we're still looking for the annual salary to be represented, but then it's only multiplied by 50% or whatever percentage that that particular individual will be working on this particular program. So whatever the percentage is, we want to make sure that you have adequate supporting documentation as to how you arrived at that particular percentage. Sometimes it's easy when we're talking about two people or one particular person sharing their time between multiple programs or grants. So the idea, if they're working on two, normally we'll see 50% of their time on one program, 50% of their time on the other. Now that could be the case. The only thing that we're suggesting is that you have adequate documentation to support that it is 50-50. Another thing, or the most important thing that I always like to tell grantees in reference to filling out the budget, is be mindful of total cost when we're dealing with a particular program. Based on other types of costs that you may not be mindful of when you're filling out the actual application, is increases, especially if a particular program is going to extend for more than a year. And most of the times we may find that a person may be transferred from one particular job function to work on a particular grant. So based on them already being with the agency, their increase as far as promotion may occur during the grant program. So if you have not already worked in an increase in salary for that particular individual, the agency may have to absorb that particular cost. So again, when you're dealing with any category or when you're dealing with the budget, it's very important that you look at the total overall cost that could be associated with this particular program. Your best way to get some of the costs, is I always like to say, is directly from your accounting system. But if we're dealing with a new program and this is the first time that you're applying for this particular program, there may not be historical cost in your accounting system. So again, whatever method you use to try to come up with your best estimate as to what these particular costs are for these particular categories, it's very important that you have supporting documentation in order to justify them. Based on that, the breakdown for that information should be presented in the spreadsheet that you're looking at. Based on the annual salary of that particular individual, that should be reflected. Based on how many years this particular grant fund will fund this particular program, you want to make sure that you include any types of increase, which is what I talked about earlier, in that particular category in order to show the increases on that particular program. And again, based on that language in reference to that particular category. So for example, we're talking about personnel. So it would be good to add some type of language saying that this person is the coordinator that is responsible for the day-to-day activities. I'm not saying that all of this information has to be a part of the application, but somewhere in the budget narrative, I should be able to go, if I'm having a problem justifying cost or analyzing various costs, I can go to the budget narrative and get more detail as to hopefully supporting documentation for the cost that you've used in that particular category. Next, fringe benefits. Fringe benefits is important because if your organization is paying fringe benefits, you want to make sure that that's also a part of the actual budget. The Department of Justice normally likes to see fringe benefits broken down into their separate budget categories. It's important to break them down into their separate categories because we do look at those costs to analyze those costs, and also based on the nature of that particular program to see whether or not there are any costs or fringe benefits that would not be allowed under that particular program. It's important to break them out for us so that we can look at them, and I'll give you an example as to why it's important. Because in some cases, or in one instance that we had, there was an organization that submitted their award package or their application package with the fringe benefits as a percentage with no detailed information. Based on the location where the application came from, they normally do have a high fringe benefits rate, but for some reason this one looked extremely high. So when we reached back out to the grantee to get supporting documentation for those costs, it was revealed to us that the organization had underfunded their pension plan in prior years, and they were going to use the grant for this particular time to catch up. So again, it's important that you break that information out for us so that we can look at it, because we need to analyze it to see whether or not it's something that's allowed under the program or whether or not it's unallowable with that particular program. So with the same thing with fringe benefits, you want to make sure that you detail them for us so that we can look at them and analyze them and see whether or not they're allowed under the program. And their percentage should match with what's in the actual application. And then again, any type of documentation that we need in reference to the budget narrative, additional information can always be provided there. Next category, travel category. The travel category is very important, and I really need you to take time to look at this particular category and be as detailed as possible, because a lot of times grantees fall short in their budget because they did not take this particular budget category serious, or at least did not, based on certain unknowns, they did not do their best estimate in order to put some cost in there that came up later on. The first thing that we really need to know is your travel policy. It's important to know the travel policy because your travel policy will let us know, based on various costs, what type of cost that you're using, whether or not you're using your own travel policy or whether or not you're using the federal guidelines. The computation of the travel needs to be explained in detail. The number of people that will be traveling and their individual costs broken out in its entirety. Again, little things that sometimes grantees forget about that you want to make sure that you include is parking fees from at the airport, travel from your home to the airport, all of those costs that a lot of times that we do not consider on a regular basis, sometimes we miss. We cannot, or you cannot, try to estimate these costs and put them in a category called miscellaneous. Miscellaneous, whatever items are in miscellaneous still can be identified. The purpose of the travel is always important. A lot of times the travel is program office related. So again, if that's the purpose of this particular travel, because the program office is requiring you to go to one of their annual trainings, then that should be the justification that you're putting in there. Per diem, you want to make sure that you're using a per diem. We normally want to say that if the per diem rate exceeds the federal guidelines, then you need to come back in for justification as to why. So I'm not saying that you cannot exceed the federal per diem, but you have to have justification and documentation to justify that. Now, here's what I mean when I say exceed. I'm not talking about anything material. So let's just say, for example, that the per diem in a particular location where you're planning on travel, let's just say that that per diem for that location is $77 a day. Based on documentation that you have in your organization, you're using your own policy, and let's just say that your policy allows you $79 for that particular location. Because it's not a large amount, I think in some cases it could be accepted to use your policy. But taking that same location, if that, based on your policy, it is $90, then we would probably not allow that because that appears to be excessive. And what we would do is require that you use the federal guidelines for per diem for this particular travel location. And again, just be as detailed as possible when it comes to travel, because a lot of times, as you can see on this slide, the last item says is this particular location is to be determined. A lot of times, grantees may fall short in this particular category because they are not sure or do not know where the actual travel is going to be. One thing that you do not want to do is base the travel on the location where you currently are. And I'll give an example. There was a to be determined conference that one particular program office was hosting. The grantee that submitted their application was in New Jersey. So they use travel guidelines for New Jersey. So basically, all they actually submitted for travel was just mileage. When the conference was actually finalized, it was actually on the West Coast. So this particular grantee did not have enough money in their travel category to go to California on the other side of the country. So again, I always say that a budget is your best guesstimate. So again, you want to, if a travel is to be determined, I would take whatever location that you are and go on the other side of the country. Because the deal is if you go to the other side of the country and that's where it is, then you've now worked in enough flexibility in your budget in order to pay for that. If it's, say, for example, in the mid part of the country, then now you have some flexibility now in that particular budget to hopefully move money to another budget category that you may not have adequately provided enough money in that particular category. So again, be mindful of to be determined, because again, you want to make sure that you use an estimate that's going to cover your organization, where your organization will not have to be burdened with that cost. Based on travel, I should be able to, again, go to the budget narrative and find out all the information I need to know about that particular category, whether or not the travel is program related, whether or not you're using your agency's policy and procedures. Again, all of that information to allow the analyst to make a decision about that particular budget category. We should be able to find that information in the budget narrative. Based on travel and lodging, one of the things that you want to take a look at is the OJP policy in reference for lodging. If by chance your organization is tasked with putting on some type of event, the OJP policy says that if you have OJP funding and you're going to be hosting an event, if it's 30 Let me know when I'm
So just do test 1, 2, 3.
Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. Sorry for the interruption. So what I'll do is I'll start back over with this particular slide here. Again, as you can see, if it says that if your funding is OJP funded and you're having 30 or more participants in an event that you're sponsoring, OJP requires that with those funds you get the federal rate for lodging. So that means that if 30 or more participants will be participating in this particular event, all of the people that will be staying at the hotel, which could be only 2, you must get the federal rate, because again, there's 30 or more participants. I do not like the last bullet, but I have to tell you about that anyway. The last bullet says that if it's less than 30, then you are exempt. I always like to tell grantees that even if it's less than 30, when you're bringing events into hotels or these types of venue, you do have some type of negotiating power with the hotel. So before you allow the establishment to charge you more than the federal rate, then I would try to in some way negotiate with them in order to try to get a reasonable rate for that particular event. That information can be found on our website in the financial guide as well as the GSA website. Again, all you have to do when you go into the GSA website is select from the information the actual city that you plan on hosting this event in, and go from there to the actual city and look at those particular rates so you can have an idea prior to selecting that particular state or city how much or what the federal rate is for that. Next is equipment. If the program allows you to buy equipment, you have several responsibilities with equipment, and I'll talk about pre-award and post-award in reference to that. But again, when we're dealing with equipment, I need to know, or you should let us know what your policy is for equipment. When I'm reviewing your application, for the most part, I have on what I want to consider my federal hat. The federal definition for equipment is equipment must have a useful life of more than 1 year and have a market value of $5,000 or greater. In your organization, that's probably not the case. Your organization probably has a useful life of more than 1 year, but your market value or value for your equipment is probably somewhere around anywhere from $7,000 to possibly $10,000. I'm sorry, from $700 to maybe $1,000. So if I'm looking at your application and I see something that's in the equipment category that does not fit that particular category, I may move it out and put it in supplies. Not unless you tell me that your agency's policy is something other than the federal guidelines. That way I'll leave that particular item in there because now I understand that you're using your guidelines for capitalization purposes for that particular equipment. In equipment, when you're listing it, it should be broken down to what I want to consider its lowest component, its lowest unit, so that we can see that. That helps us look at the equipment and analyze its costs. But on the other end, it also helps you when you no longer have a need for that particular equipment. If the equipment, and I'll talk about that on another slide. And finally, the purpose of that particular equipment. How is that equipment going to be used in this particular award? So again, I talked about the useful life of equipment and its fair market value. When you no longer have a need for that equipment, and again, once the grant program has closed, as long as you can still use that equipment for its original purpose, you can continue to use that particular equipment. The federal agency is concerned with that equipment when you decide that you no longer have a need for that particular equipment. So now I need to know its fair market value. If its fair market value is less than $5,000, you can keep that particular equipment. You can trade it in for new equipment. You can give it to another organization. I'm concerned with it when it's over $5,000. So if it's under, you have no more recourse back with the federal agency. You can continue to use it. If it's over $5,000, then you must call the funding source and ask for disposition requirements. Normally, and you have to understand this, the federal government isn't in the business of housing equipment. So what we're going to suggest is that you sell the equipment and send the federal share back to the federal agency. The best way to determine the federal share is if the award that you have has a matching requirement, and let's just say the matching requirement is 75-25%. Once you sell the equipment, if the 75% represents the federal share, that amount needs to come back to the agency, and then you can keep the 25%. However, if the program is 100% funded by the federal government, That doesn't mean that all of the money comes back to the agency, but we do expect a certain amount of it, and that amount is 90%, because we allow the organization to take 10% for selling purposes. So again, we realized that you had to do certain things in order to get that particular equipment ready to sell. So we allow you to take 10% off if it's 100% federally funded. Again, based on equipment, we should see that broken down on the budget sheet. Again, everything in reference to that equipment should be listed in there. And then in the narrative, if you can say how this equipment is going to be utilized on this particular program, that will help the analysts get a feel for the actual equipment and the total cost of that particular equipment. Supplies. Supplies are items that you also need on this particular program. Here's one thing I want to say about supplies. The prior slide, I talked about equipment and breaking equipment down to its lowest component. I do not want you to do that for supplies. I'd rather not see that you need 10 pencils, 17 paper clips. So what I'm looking for you to do is group them in their categories. So as you can see, office supplies, postage, or whatever, put them in their categories. Now, be mindful now, if we're talking about postage, and let's just say hypothetically that postage cost in the application happens to be $8,000, okay, I may need additional information to explain why postage is $8,000. Not saying that it can't be, but again, something to the effect that you're responsible for generating newsletters that will be going out to the community, and we're doing that for, let's just say, 15, 20,000 people in the community, and we're doing these mail outs quarterly. See, now I can get an idea as to why postage is as high as it is, but again, it by itself will probably cause me to question that particular item. And again, all of the items for supplies should be listed, the amounts, the total cost, and down in the narrative, again, you may want to put some language as to how all of these supplies will relate to that particular program. Contractual. There are basically what I want to consider two types of contractual agreements that a grantee can enter into, with an agency or with an individual. If we're talking about an individual or consultant rates, we normally, for OJP purposes, we normally say that you cannot pay more than $450 a day to an individual for services that they provide to you. On the other hand, if we're talking about an agency that's going to be providing service for you, I'm concerned about that particular contract if that contract is over $100,000 and you've only received one bid on that particular contract. So we consider that to be a sole source. And based on that, and we're not saying that you cannot enter into a sole source contract, we would just want to look at that particular contract because we found in the past that in some cases the grantee has created the sole source contract there by limiting the specs on various types of items. So again, not saying that you cannot enter into a sole source, but we would like to look at it and you need prior approval. Again, based on the contractual, everything should be listed out in the budget category. Again, budget narrative, I should be able to go to the budget narrative and find the information that I need. And let me just back up for a minute based on sole source. Even if the contract is not over $100,000 and you still sole source, we're not saying that you cannot sole source, but you should document your records as to why you went sole source for that particular entity. And here's what you have to keep in mind. If I happen to add money to that particular individual the next year, once it gets to $100,000, now I need prior approval. So it will not be, as long as this individual is performing the same service, and I'll give you an example. Let's just say for the first year funding, it's $50,000. I'm just documenting my records. as to why I chose this individual and went sole source. If the next year I use this same individual for the same service for another $50,000, now I'm at $100,000 and I need prior approval before this person can continue providing services for me. Construction. Normally construction is not allowable under most OJP programs, but under the CTAS program there are two categories that do allow construction. So again, the information for that particular category needs to be detailed out, the basis of the actual construction. All the items that will represent all of this construction, all of that needs to be presented in this particular category. And again, based on the actual budget line items, it's being reflected in there, all of the things that will involve that in that construction. Again, narrative, I should be still being able to go to the budget narrative and find out the majority of the information if I have questions in reference to that particular category. Now, the other category. Normally I like to say that if it did not fit neatly in the categories that I just went over, then it must go in the other category. Now, the thing with the other category, it needs to be detailed too. I shouldn't see anything that says miscellaneous because it's the other category in this particular category. Again, whatever it is, whether we're talking about rent, utilities, whatever it is, I should be able to, or you should be able to break out each component for me so that I can analyze that and make a decision on that particular category. Based on that, again, based on the spreadsheet, it should be reflected on there and narrative to help me understand that particular item. Indirect cost. If the program allows you to charge indirect costs back to this particular program, again, you want to get an approved rate from your cognizant federal agency. Your cognizant federal agency is whichever agency provides you with the most federal funding. So again, and I'll give you an example, let's just say that you have several funding streams, and let's just say HHS or Health and Human Services provides you with $2 million annually, and OJP or the Department of Justice only provides you with $500,000 annually. So that would mean HHS would be your cognizant federal agency. You would have to send your indirect cost package to them to approve. We will accept that, but we just will not review it. And again, that cognizant federal agency is also responsible for resolving any audit findings against your particular program. Again, you have to have a current rate when you submit your application. If you do not submit it with your application, it's not that we will not take it, but again, before that application will be where you can charge any costs or indirect costs, it has to be approved prior to you charging costs against the indirect cost category. Again, the budget category that reflects that should show that. Then once everything is done for that particular program or that particular funding stream that you're applying for, the summary of that should list all of the funding sources for the CTAS program that you will be applying for. Now, one of the things that we notice when we are looking at various types of applications is that various reasons applications do not pass the budget process on the first time. Based on one thing I think I always want to suggest to grantees is that when you put the application together, I would encourage you to let someone else in your office look at what you're getting ready to submit. But I encourage you to have someone look at it that's far enough removed from the project, that doesn't totally understand the project, where they can catch some of the things that we may question here in the agency. A person who is close to the project will probably gloss over something and say, well, I understand what you mean. But if you give it to someone else that's far enough removed from the program and address their questions that they have in reference to that particular application, I think you stand a better chance of your application moving through the entire process, hopefully with minimum to no kickbacks. Some of the reasons why they don't clear is that it's missing the detailed worksheet. The computations are incorrect, and what I mean is real grossly incorrect. If we're rounding errors or stuff, situations like that, that's not a big issue because we can correct that on our end. But again, with the template that you're using now, it calculates all of the numbers for you. If there's a matching requirement, you have to make sure that you identify the source of match and where it's coming from. Unallowable costs. Again, if a lot of times based on the solicitation, all of the costs that could be allowed under that program may not be included in the solicitation. However, prior to adding costs that you may have a question about, I would probably reach out to the organization first before adding it, because again, if it's unallowable, that will slow up my process of reviewing that. The not having the required breakdown for each budget categories. Remember when I talked about fringe benefits? As opposed to giving me just the fringe benefits rate that you're using, I'm looking for a breakdown of all of the items in that particular category. Incomplete budget narrative. It's important that that budget narrative is complete. If you're a new organization or a nonprofit organization with us, one of the things that we're looking for you to do is to complete a financial capability questionnaire, which we call the FCQs. Another reason is that the prior budget did not clear. This happens, and it's rare, but it does happen. And what I mean is, from the prior budget didn't clear, is that you submitted a application to us last year. We looked at it and we found discrepancies with that particular application. We sent it back to the organization, but they have failed to resolve those. So another year has come up and they're applying for, and they're eligible to apply for additional fundings, but I cannot award that second funding or allow them to draw down on the second funding until the first funding has been cleared. The indirect cost rate, again, has not been submitted. So you don't have to submit it with your application, but you want to make sure that after you sign off on the award, that after that you get it in so that you can start charging against that particular program. And then memos for information was sent back to us, but it wasn't sufficient enough in order to resolve whatever issues we've had. So again, if the organization sends you a memo saying that your application is pending based on various items, it's important that you resolve those items as quickly as possible and get them back to the funding agency. All of this information that I talked about that can help you submit your application can be found in the current edition of the financial guide, which is the 2013 financial guide. I would encourage you to use this prior to submitting your application and after you're awarded, because the financial guide can help you move through your program when you have certain types of issues. A lot of your answers can be answered by utilizing the financial guide. For any assistance that you may need, I also encourage you to contact the OCFO's Customer Service Center. Their hours of operation is from 8:30 a.m. to 6 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can email them for any questions that you may have if you need something back from them in writing. But again, if you call them between those hours that I stated, then you can talk to a live person. And I know how important it is to talk to a live body with the Department of Justice.
Thank you, Michael. Lots of great information passed on to potential grantees. So now is the Q&A segment, and several questions have been submitted. So we appreciate your patience as we go through each of these questions and allow the appropriate person to respond. Here's the first question. Programmatically, isn't it an advantage to use specific names in a program narrative and attach their resumes rather than just a job description? That is, when there is a person already in place.
Matt?
Hello, this is Julius Dupree with the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and I just wanted to respond to that question. Programmatically, it is best if you do have the names of the folks that are going to be, doing the work, to have those names in the narrative, and also include that resume. So that the answer to that is yes.
Thank you, Julius. Question 2. Is hotel tax added into lodging costs, or is it separate?
Taxes for hotels is a separate. When you're dealing with the per diem for lodging, it's just the nightly rate for the particular hotel. So the taxes are something that is allowable, but that's a good point because grantees, that's another cost that I talked about earlier that sometimes grantees forget to include in their application. But again, yes, it is not a part of the lodging rate that you'll see on their website. So again, you can always find out that city's tax rate and then calculate what that should be for that particular city that you're in.
We are a tribal after-school program that provides cultural, physical, and educational activities for tribal youth in our community. During the school year, we provide everyday activities. We also take various days and overnight trips. As part of our regular program, we provide healthy snacks and meals for our trips. Under Purpose Area 9, are we allowed to include food as part of our program budget?
I'm assuming, this is Linda Rosen from OJJDP, I'm assuming you're talking about youth, and I think there's been some special policy determined about that. I would like to check because it's constantly changing, and I'd get back to you on that. What we'll do is we'll answer your question, and then NTAC will send it out to everybody who's participating in this webinar, so you all have that answer. Thank you.
So again, whatever questions don't get fully responded to today, they will be sent to everyone that's registered for clarification. The next question. The computer isn't over $5,000. Should it be considered equipment?
This will help you, but unfortunately, I'm going to have to say it depends. And when I say it depends, what is your organization's capitalization policy? Again, you can't use two. If your organization has a equipment policy or a capitalization policy, that's the policy that you should follow. So if your organization's policy says that equipment is something that is $700, then that everything that's in your application that's equipment should be from $700 on up. So you're absolutely right. If we're talking about a computer, a laptop, or something like that, that is not $5,000, and your organization says that, let's just say that this particular laptop that's $1,000 is considered equipment, then you would list it under equipment. But if you're following the federal guidelines for $5,000, then no, it is not equipment.
What about software? Where does it fall?
Software, depending on the nature of the software, I've seen it in several places. I've seen it in equipment. I've also seen it in the other category. Because the thing that's tricky about software, a lot of times when you receive this particular software, and I hate to use this term, but half the time it's obsolete by the time you actually receive it. So I've seen it in the equipment category. I've seen it in the other category. Again, wherever you put it at, justify why you're putting it there. If the analyst asks you to move it, just go ahead and move it, as opposed to getting into any type of confrontation back and forth with them. So again, I've seen it in both. I've seen it in the equipment category, and I've also seen it in the other category.
I'm confused about the buyback that Michael was referencing earlier. At the end of our grant period, we have to give back 90% of the purchase value to the government, and this has to be reflected somewhere.
Okay, let me clarify that, and let's not use the term buyback, because it's not buyback. Here's what I was trying to convey. If you buy equipment with the grant, and you can remember, you can use that equipment for as long as you have a need for it. When you no longer have a need for it, I am concerned with its fair market value. If its fair market value is $5,000 or greater, you must contact the funding source and ask for disposition requirements. If it's under $5,000, then you can retain it. Now, the example that I gave is that in some programs, the grantee is required to put in a match. The 90% meant that a grantee did not put in a match. So let's just say that this particular equipment is over $5,000. You sell it and get exactly $5,000 for it. So 90% of that money needs to come back to the federal agency, and 10% you can keep, because again, remember, the entire award was funded by the federal agency, and there was no match from the grantee. But again, our goal is, when you buy equipment off of the grant, is that you use it forever and ever. So we'll never have to worry about sending it back.
In developing a cost estimate, should we use Davis-Bacon wage rates? In developing a cost estimate, should we use Davis-Bacon wage rates?
In developing a cost estimate, depending on the actual category where you're doing this estimate from, I would probably try to be more, and I'll use the term realistic. And here's what I mean. If I'm going to hire a position or create a position within my organization, then if it's a normal position, then I probably have that data as far as dollar amounts within my organization. If I don't have it, I can always go to the local or labor department to find out what the going rate is for that particular position. So now it all depends on whether or not we're talking about equipment. Okay, I could probably use that, but if I'm talking about equipment, then I probably would want to go to IBM or Hewlett Packard to find out what the going rate is for this type of equipment. I think there I can get a better pricing for the actual item. So again, I'm not saying that you can't use it, but I would probably use some type of software or lookup where I can get more of a realistic number.
If you do not have a current indirect rate, can you still apply and not have indirect as a part of your budget narrative?
Good afternoon. This is Ann Beeman. I'm with the COPS office. I would like to answer that question in specific for purpose area 1 only. If you do not have a current indirect cost rate, I'm assuming for FY14, you need to have a letter from your cognizant agency stating that you're in preparation to apply for, that you have applied for it, and if you need to attach that along with your documentation, and that way we will accept it. For all agencies that do not have a current indirect cost rate, your indirect cost rate will be removed for purpose area 1 only.
That's fine.
This is Byron Vaughn. I'm also with the Office of the Chief Financial Officer. If you don't have a indirect cost rate, then you don't have to apply for it on all the other purpose areas. It's just for those that have an indirect cost rate. Yes, you can apply for it, and you can draw down funds if your rate is or has been currently approved by your cognizant federal agency.
Why does it take 6 months after award before the budget is approved?
Again, this is Byron Vaughn. I'm with the OCFO's office. We do apologize that sometimes it takes a little bit longer than normal. I guess last year there were some unusual circumstances that occurred, but normally, you know, we're being very diligent in trying to get these budgets approved and cleared in a timely fashion.
And yes, this is Julius Dupree, and I think one of the things that can be done is that in order to kind of expedite the budget review process, and which is really the impetus for this particular webinar, is to ensure that your budget is as detailed as possible, that you've broken out all the costs, as Michael has said, you have your program narrative in place, and so you know if you have a high quality budget, it is very likely that you can get a pretty quick financial clearance on that. So that's something to keep in mind because the back and forth does take a long time, especially when you factor in holidays and weekends and everything. And back and forth can really extend things pretty far. So.
Should salary include the 90-day closeout period in the budget?
The answer to that question is no. It should basically be for the grant period. If it's going to be a year or 2 years or 3 years, that's what the salary cost estimate should be for.
If graphs or charts are used, do they have to be in 12-point type also? If so, some things may not fit.
We're thinking that's a programmatic issue, and because normally we're just dealing with the automated budget, and so I will leave that question for Julius to answer.
Yes, thank you, Byron. To answer that question, if you have charts that are used, I mean, you don't have to use 12-point font for the charts. So just ensure that the charts are readable, obviously. So.
Great questions. What about Purpose Area 5? Is food allowable?
We got kicked out. We kicked out.
That question is for OVW, and there isn't a representative present here. And so you can, yeah, we will get back to you about that question. But thank you.
Okay, lots of great questions coming in. We're keeping up with you. Next question. With purchase of vehicles, how long do we wait until those vehicles can be sold or traded? Is there a specific time frame?
Let me answer that question in two ways. First of all, when we allow you to buy equipment, whether it's vehicles, computers, or whatever, our intent is hopefully that you would use them, like I said earlier, forever and ever. So they wouldn't be sold, not unless they are no longer feasible or usable for the particular organization, and you are selling it, or I want to use the term trading it in for another vehicle to continue the original uses of that program. But again, the key is once you no longer have a need for that particular item, whether it's computers or vehicles, again, we're concerned when its fair market value is $5,000 or greater. So again, if it's under $5,000, because I'll give you an example. Let's just say that we bought a vehicle and we kept that vehicle for 15 years. 9 times out of 10, it is not worth $5,000. So again, you can trade it in, give it away. For the most part, the federal government isn't that much concerned with it, but it's only when it's over $5,000 and you don't have a need for it anymore that we're concerned. So again, that is when you no longer have a need for it.
The budget detail worksheets on GMS are for Excel 2007 and earlier, or Excel 2013. I have Excel 2010. Which form is compatible with Excel 2010?
Byron Vaughn, OCFO. I would think that you would be able to get a copy of the 2013 from GMS, but we will look into which spreadsheet is compatible with 2010. I was thinking that 2013 would be compatible with 2010, but if you're having a problem, we'll talk to the GMS Help Desk folks to see which version is compatible with 2010.
Do we need to attach our program policy or reference it in our budget?
That I would say yes, depending on, like, for the examples that I gave. If your travel policy is something other than the federal government, then yes, I would need to see that in order to see whether or not it's something that we will accept or require you to use the federal guidelines. So yeah, if your policies are something other than the federal government, federal guidelines, then I would say yes. Remember what I said about equipment, because remember, if your policy says that equipment is something that you capitalize at $500, then it's a good thing. It doesn't have to be for equipment, but again, that's a good thing to see or to attach it with it. So yes.
In regards to equipment, if the equipment is over $5,000, should a computer be listed as supplies or other?
Again, it depends. If the equipment, regardless of what it is, if it's more than $5,000, what I need for you to do is determine what your agency's policy is for equipment. Because if it's over $5,000 and your organization's capitalization policy is under that, then that naturally that would be listed under equipment. So again, what I'm trying to encourage you to understand is that we need you to follow your own agency's policy. We will get involved if your agency policy conflicts with the federal guidelines because it's more liberal. Okay, we find that in most cases an agency's policy is more restrictive than the federal guidelines.
We are a new Department of Public Safety Commission. I am new to this process and not sure what category we fall under. I'm thinking comprehensive planning. How do I know what would meet our needs as a new program? Let me restate the question. We are a new Department of Public Safety Commission. I am new to this process and not sure what category we fall under. I'm thinking comprehensive planning. How do I know what would meet our needs as a new program?
This is Julius Dupree with Bureau of Justice Assistance, and actually the Purpose Area 2 it would be a great place to start because that is a comprehensive justice systems-wide planning. So if you don't know quite exactly what you all want to do, it's best to do that analysis or that assessment up front so you can determine what the gaps are and the needs are within your justice system. So yeah, that Purpose Area 2 might be a great place for you all to start.
This next question has two parts. I'll ask each separately. For federal construction contracts, we're usually bound by DB wage rates for construction activities. My question was asked when you were on the construction area of the budget description.
I think the second one looks like it's answering now. The second one is answering the first one.
Okay, this is Julius Dupree again. Just wanted to address that particular question. Davis-Bacon wage, that's a very specific requirement of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act grants, but it is not it's not applicable to the current I guess the non-Recovery Act, if you will, tribal justice infrastructure projects.
Thank you, Julius. How many days should we budget for the 4 required trainings?
In order to budget for a training that consists of 4 days, I would say that you're budgeting for, based on your agency's policy, you would be budgeting for 6. And here's what I mean. The actual training is for 4 days, but then you have a travel day in front and a travel day behind. So actually it should be 6 days, but keep in mind those travel days are normally billed at half a day.
Okay. Yeah. Now, I'd like to add as far as those trainings are concerned. Each office has specific requirements around how much time should be allocated for trainings. But what it is basically is there's going to be an orientation training, which is actually been condensed to 1 day. So you would want to go ahead and say at least a 3-day trip, according to what Micah was saying. So you got the travel day, you got the actual conference, and then you may have another travel day. So I'd say 3 days for that. And then the purpose area specific travel, which is the second training, I would go ahead and put in at least, 3 or 4 days for that, just to be safe. Because see, what happens is you want that cushion. But if it turns out that the training is going to be less days than you budgeted for, then you can always reprogram or reallocate that funding or modify it so that you can put it towards something else. So, while we do want, some real, while we want details, an approximate, amounts for travel, we do understand that, some of these amounts may change, and then, that we may have to revise the budgets, as appropriate. So.
Purpose Area 4 allows for renovations, but will it allow for any other budget categories, such as supplies? And how likely will it be approved if it's that far out of the scope of the funding interest?
Okay, this is Julius Dupree again, and as far as the supplies category goes, I mean, if it's supplies that are directly related to the renovation or construction of the facility, then that's fine. But we will not fund any supplies that would go towards operational costs, because that is outside the scope of our program. Our scope stops once that building's been constructed. That's when our scope ends.
Thanks for your patience. The next question. Purpose Area 4 allows for renovations, but will it allow for any other budget categories? Did I already? Okay. Thank you. I just realized I've already asked that one. In Purpose Area 5, do we have to budget the entire $20,000 for training?
Byron Vaughn, OCFO. That purpose area is for OVW, but that 20,000 for training is like a maximum. So you don't have to, budget for all the 20,000, but that's just put in there as a maximum that they will allow for training.
Okay, this is Julius Dupree, and I wanted to clarify, I wanted to actually respond to a question that was asked earlier about food and beverage under the Purpose Area 5. And to answer that question, I did have someone from the OVW office, financial office, get back to me on that. It said basically the answer is generally no. However, food can be allowable under very limited circumstances. For example, food could be approved to provide meals at a victim services shelter. So, so I would look at how it would tie into your program, and then if you could always submit it in your budget, and it'll just go through another layer of review, and then they would let you know whether or not it's allowable, whether you have to take it out of the budget. So.
We have approximately 10 minutes left for questions, so if there are other things that are lingering or other clarifications that you would like, please send your inquiries via the chat window. Earlier, CTAS required a $20,000 mandatory set-aside for travel. Are you saying that there is no mandatory set-aside of $20,000 for travel in CTAS Purpose Area 14?
I think it's 4. I think it means purpose area 4. It's only 9. I think that's 4.
Purpose Area 4.
Hello, this is Julius Dupree again, and I'm just going to respond to this question on behalf of OVW because it is. I just want to provide clarification about that $20,000 budget amount, and you know, the answer to that question is that it is a requirement that is listed in the solicitation, which I wasn't aware of previously, especially since that's not my purpose area that I manage. But according to this guidance, you must, you know, from the lower 48 states, you must budget $20,000 and travel over the course of the project for OVW. So so please, and that includes the 2 required DOJ sponsored trainings that are, you know, that are part of the solicitation, and then applicants from Alaska must budget $25,000. So that's even more. So follow those guidelines. And again, you know, if for some reason you don't use that full $20,000 or $25,000, then you can reprogram it, and then you can, you know, as long as it's tied to your programmatic goals and it's consistent with the goals, you can use it for something else.
Thank you.
If we put a meth officer in Purpose Area 1, are we required to pay the 4th year on this officer?
Hi, this is Ann with the COPS office. For a meth officer, there is no retention requirements.
Regarding equipment disposition, if the FMV is greater than $5,000 and we retain the equipment, do we have to pay DOJ for the value of the equipment above $5,000 or the full value?
The answer to that would be no, because as long as you're still using it, because that's the key. If it's over $5,000 and you still have a need for it during the award period and after the award period, as long as you're still using it for its original purpose, then you can continue to use it. Again, we're only concerned when you notify us that you no longer have a need for it.
In Purpose Area 2, are snacks and drinks allowable during an 8-hour training if the closest eatery is over 10 miles away?
This is Julius Dupree with the Bureau of Justice Assistance, and you know, generally, it's really going to be very difficult to get approval for food and beverage again, and I'm going to allude to what I talked to earlier. I mean, if it's somehow tied into the program, you know, some victim services shelter, or helping folks going through treatment and needing, you know, to eat while they're, you know, going through day reporting or treatment or whatever. I mean, that's the type of stuff that where food and beverage is allowed. But generally, if you're wanting food and beverage for staff or for folks working on a project because of because of the distance. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to really it's going to be favorably approved, unfortunately. But again, I mean, these are things that we look at things on a case-by-case basis. If you think you have a strong enough case to have food and beverage at an event, just please submit it. It can't hurt. It'll get reviewed, and if we don't approve it, you'll know. But I mean, it's not something that should stop you from putting in the application, because what will happen is these budgets are going to go through another layer of review. They're going to go through another review process. What's going to happen is it'll go through peer review and it'll be generally looked at. And it may be noted that this person has a questionable budget line item in there, but that again, if you're selected for funding, that's going to be looked at later down the line, and then the program manager will get back to you and let you know whether or not that's an allowable item. So.
One question I want to get out there in reference to the beverage. Someone just asked, I just want to confirm that I heard correctly. Food and beverages would be okay for participants who are in need of groceries.
And this is Julius Dupree. Generally, we couldn't use. I can just speak across the board that food for groceries for folks in the program would not be allowable. But again, there are some cases where food and beverages could be allowed. Like I said, the victims at a victim shelter or something to that effect. But what I would do, since this is a very specific question regarding a very very specific purpose area, there's going to be a OVW webinar on February 11th, and it's going to be at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And so we're going to be putting the registration information up on our website. But I would strongly encourage you to tune into that particular webinar, and get more specific OVW questions answered that way.
So a good time to remind you all that the web meeting that occurred on Monday was a general overview for CTAS. The meeting that we're in now is related to budgets. And in February, on February 11th and 20th, there will be specific web meetings related to each purpose area. So as early as tomorrow, but maybe as late as Monday, begin looking for the registration opportunities to participate in those individual purpose area web meetings to get further clarification on each purpose area. We have just 5 minutes left and probably 3 more questions that we want to quickly respond to before we end the event today. Let's see, where did we leave off? I think
There's
we're
one right up there about $56 an hour. Yeah.
So let's start here. Our consultant costs allowed still at $56 an hour.
Let me clarify that. Honestly, I want to say that I'm embarrassed to actually say this, but based on the funding source or the organization, that amount may be different. So let me give them to you. If you have an OJP grant, then the maximum amount that you can pay a individual is $450 for an 8-hour day. If you have a COPS grant, then the max that you can pay a individual for an 8-hour day is $550. And if you have an OVW grant, the max that you can pay an individual for an 8-hour day is $650.
Do you have to put a budget mod into repurpose funds if they are directly related to program and program goals? Let me restate that. Do you have to put a budget mod in to repurpose funds if they are directly related to program and program goals?
This is Byron Vaughn. Yes, if it exceeds 10% of the award amount, yes, you do have to submit a budget modification game.
Hi, this is Ann Beeman with the COPS office. As far as a budget mod is concerned, we do not do the 10% rule. If you are going to change categories or you need to increase your items, you have to do a budget mod for the COPS office. And this can be done through our COPS portal.
Okay, you all are taking us down the wire here. A few more questions. Let's see how many we can get in 3 minutes. Where it states addressing youth, is this the only goal that we can only budget 10%, but still budget more than 10% for other goals, objectives in Area 5? Do I understand this correctly?
That's OV.
In reference to that question, it would be great to tune in on February 11th for the OVW's web meeting that relates to this question. Additionally, if you have not already looked at the handout pod, you will see that there is a list of point of contacts for each of the purpose areas. I would encourage you to access that handout and download it for your files. One more question. We intend to have contract employees stationed at the Arizona Fusion Center. Where are the specifics needed for those two FTEs?
Okay. For these two individuals, naturally there has to be a contract specifying their specifics. Again, like with the personnel category, the responsibilities, the compensation that they will be paid, the responsibilities, all of that, like a resume, all of that is no different from a regular employee, but the deal is this contract. So it needs to be very specific as to what it is you're expecting them to do in that particular position.
So,
Can you restate? I thought you- The 10% and clarifying the 10% rule. When you're moving money between the 10%, it's the total amount of the award. So here's what I mean. If the award is for $200,000, that means 10% or $20,000. I can move between approved budget categories, okay? And that's, again, for OJP without prior approval, because it's different when you're dealing with COPS, because, again, there is no 10% rule with the COPS office. Cool.
I'm also to dovetail on what Mike was talking about with the contract employees that are stationed at the Arizona Fusion Center. Just, break it out and show their annual salary and then their hours and their hourly wage, and also, break out their fringe benefits. Like he was saying, just like you would display it up in the personnel and fringe benefit categories. And that, should be sufficient for our satisfaction.
Add one other thing in reference about the 10%. You have to keep in mind for OJP grants that it's cumulative, and here's what I mean. If based on the award this month I move 5% into a budget category, then that's okay. If I move it the next couple months 3%, now I'm up to 8%. 6 months down the road I move an additional 2%. Now I'm at 10%, and now I need prior approval before I can complete that.
This is good. This is Linda from OJJDP. I also want to add to that, although it's not required for a budget modification and approved budget for a change under 10%, as Mike was saying, it's still a good idea to document these things. That way you're covered in case of an audit, and we have a record, you have a record of exactly what's taken place, and it just simplifies your life.
Okay. Hi, this is Ann Beamer with the COPS office again. I just want to add clarity about the meth question for the meth officer. Under Purpose Area 1, you're hiring for officers. There is no specific category for a meth officer. It's for a sworn law enforcement officer. You are subject to positions under the meth category where you can apply for meth specific items. But you cannot specifically say apply for a meth officer, because all officer positions, sworn law enforcement officer positions, are required to maintain the 12-month retention period. And if you have any further questions about that, feel free to give me a call. My contact information is listed.
Okay. Well, on behalf of our Department of Justice and the CTAS Training and Technical Assistance Team, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on today's webinar. Please stay tuned for more details about the purpose area specific webinars that will be scheduled actually for February 11th and 20th. We will be posting that information to our Tribal Justice and Safety website, and that's www.usdoj.gov/tribal. Thanks to everyone, and good luck with the application process.